When it comes to folks living in glass houses and throwing stones, you just can't beat a Trinitarian accusing other folks of holding self-contradictory views. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. We've finally finished his discussion of the Columbo tactic, including a detailed discussion of how to defeat it, and now he's moving on to specific topics that Greg thinks believers need to know how to handle, starting with the lowest of the low-hanging fruit, self-defeating arguments. Or at least Greg thinks they're self-defeating, and as we'll see, that ain't always the case. As I mentioned last time, Chapter 10 has the rather tasteless title of, quote, Suicide, Views That Self-Destruct, end quote. And I think that's kind of tacky, but that's Greg for you. Greg spends a couple sections talking about why self-contradictory ideas is self-defeating, as if that weren't obvious, and then continues his theme of suicide by giving self-contradictory ideas a formal name. Quote, when an idea or objection violates the law of non-contradiction in a straightforward fashion, I call it formal suicide. To determine whether a view has suicidal tendencies, first pay attention to the basic idea, premise, conviction, or claim. Try to identify it. Next, ask if the claim applies to itself. If so, is there a conflict? Can it be stated in the form A is the case and A is not the case? If so, it commits suicide. End quote. So there's our baseline. If a statement works out to say both that A is true and that A is not true, it's a self-defeating statement, or as Greg calls it, a formal suicide. And that's Greg's own standard, so he shouldn't mind if and we applies it to his own arguments. So which arguments does Greg think is self-defeating? Well, let's look at a few examples. Quote, the postmodern claim there is no truth invites an obvious question. Is the claim that there is no truth itself a true statement, or is it false? If false, then false. If alleged true, then false again. End quote. And yeah, his wording here is a little wooden, but Greg has the gist of it correctly. You can't claim to be making a true statement that denies the existence of true statements. That's just a straight-up self-contradiction. So, okay, I'm with Greg on this one. Greg's next example, though, ain't quite so straightforward. Quote, can God make a rock so big he can't lift it? This kind of challenge is called a pseudo question. It's like asking, can God win an arm wrestling match against himself? Or can God's power defeat his own power? The question is nonsense because it treats God as if he were two instead of one. End quote. And already Greg's in trouble because this section is about self-contradictory statements, and the question ain't a statement, it's a question. So it can't be self-contradictory. And notice it ain't a pseudo question either. Greg's just saying that to poison the well by implying that there's something defective about it, but it's a perfectly legitimate question. The problem here stems from the Christian premise that the question's interrogating. According to the Bible, God can do all things, or in other words, he's supposedly omnipotent. But is true omnipotence even a logically coherent concept? In order to be truly omnipotent, God would have to be able to do literally anything, including creating a situation where it would be impossible for him to do something. A is true and A is not true in the same statement of omnipotence. By Greg's own standard, it's the Christian premise and not the question about the premise that defeats itself. The question is perfectly sensible. It's the answer that's nonsense. And of course, most believers resolve this problem by situationally conceding that God's power ain't literally unlimited. And by situationally, I mean they'll only admit it as long as you're pointing out the problem. As soon as the subject changes, they'll go right back to claiming that God can do all things again. Faith's kind of magical that way. Next example, quote, God doesn't take sides. This reprimand comes up every election cycle. I once saw a full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times lecturing one side of the political spectrum on this very point. The assertion is self-defeating, though, as illustrated in the following conversation. End quote. And Greg goes on to imagine a conversation in which he says, "We disagree about whether God takes sides. In this debate, whose side do you think God is on?" And of course, Greg's strawman opponent declares that God is on their side, thus making a self-defeating argument. Ta-da! Take a bow, Greg. What Greg is overlooking here is the fact that the other person don't have to claim that God is taking their side in the debate. Regardless of his own personal opinions, God could take a hands-off approach to the debate in the interest of letting us work things out for ourselves. Just like how he takes a hands-off approach to letting us quote-unquote sin. So while you could make a self-defeating argument about God not taking sides, it ain't an inherently self-defeating argument on its own. Plus, of course, it's all moot since God's an imaginary character who's going to take whatever side the believer wants to imagine him taking, if any. The whole point of having an imaginary almighty deity dictating how folks should live is so you can have an unfalsifiable authority for your own notions of how other folks ought to live. And that's why Greg gets his panties in a bunch whenever anybody suggests that God don't take sides. Next up, the mental gymnastics portion of our program. Quote, "A common attack on the Bible goes like this. Men wrote the Bible, people are imperfect, therefore the Bible is flawed and not inspired by God." End quote. And that's an impressive leap from the "people are imperfect" to the "therefore" there. A much more reasonable conclusion would simply be, therefore, the Bible needs to be fact-checked. But that's the last conclusion Greg wants anybody to reach because he knows that Bible accounts frequently fail to pass an unbiased fact-check. So instead, Greg invents an imaginary conversation with a skeptic, in which he gets the skeptic to eventually agree that folks don't always make mistakes. And then Greg hits him with this little zinger. Quote, "If people don't always make mistakes, though, you can't rule out the Bible just because people wrote it, can you?" End quote. And of course, this is trivially obvious as a straw man. Nobody's arguing that the Bible is wrong just because it was written by fallible folks. Objections to the historicity of the Bible are based on internal and external contradictions in the text, obvious agendas, and, stuff like talking snakes and talking donkeys and stuff. But Greg ignores all that in favor of inventing a self-defeating straw man making arguments that nobody makes, just so's he can claim it's self-defeating. Next up, Greg demonstrates his limited understanding of Eastern mysticism. Quote, "Hinduism as a religious view also seems compromised by contradictory notions. The pantheistic monism at the heart of some versions of this Eastern religion teaches that reality as we know it is an illusion, Maya, of which each of us is a part. This Hindu concept that the world is an illusion contradicts the idea that I can know that I am a player in the illusion. Implicitly, it claims that I am not a real self and that I am a real self at the same time. Thus, this central doctrine of Hinduism self-destructs." End quote. Now, personally, I don't think any Trinitarian Christian ought to be going around throwing stones at other religions on account of contradictions. If you're going to go around telling folks that the Father is God and the Son is God and the Spirit is God and there's all three different, but there's only one God, then you need to figure out your own contradictions before you go around criticizing anyone else's. Take the log out of your own eye, so to speak. But of course, I ain't going to defend Hinduism, as interesting as it may be. I think religions in general is the result of folks making stuff up to try and explain a complex world, and that includes Eastern religions. Christian critiques of Hinduism, though, is just more pots calling kettles black. Hindus has their Maya and Christians has their miracles, and in both cases, folks believes in them basically just because someone told them so and they've just taken their word for it. A miracle, by definition, is something that ain't consistent with what we actually observe in the real world, which also happens to be the definition for things that ain't true. So a true miracle would be one that meets the standards for not being true, which makes it both true and not true at the same time, and that meets Greg's standard for a self-defeating argument. But he's going to go on ahead regardless and point fingers at Hindus for having the same kind of faith as he does, but just about different ideas. Quote, "One escape route people have tried in order to avoid this problem is to claim that the law of non-contradiction is a Western notion that doesn't apply in Eastern thought like Hinduism. Eastern thinkers are comfortable with contradiction, so they say. The problem, though, has nothing to do with what people are comfortable with. It has to do with how reality is structured. End quote. But here's where Greg is just displaying his own failure to understand Eastern mysticism. If in everything is Maya an illusion, then even the contradiction is an illusion. Or in other words, it's only an apparent contradiction. And apparent contradictions don't necessarily violate the law of non-contradictions, so they ain't no gotcha here. And again, I ain't saying that Hinduism is right, I'm just saying that Greg's refutation here don't carry the weight he thinks it does. He's going to pull this gotcha on a Hindu, and the Hindu just going to shrug. Then again, most Christians is probably going to nod their heads and say, "Good 'un, Greg, you really nailed them Hindus." And since Christians is the primary audience for apologists like Greg, he's going to count that as a win. So what you going to do? Greg's next example is one of my favorites because it really helps illustrate the fact that creator gods is imaginary characters. And the thing about imaginary gods is that whenever you's making up your creation myth, you can have your creator god do anything you's willing and able to imagine. But one thing your god can't do, and this is a distinctive characteristic of imaginary gods, is they can't do nothing that you ain't willing and able to imagine, as Greg demonstrates here. Quote, "Some people suggest that God used evolution to design the world. It may sound reasonable for God to use evolution, but if you look closer, I think you will see the problem. Either God designs the details of the biological world, or nature shuffles the deck and natural selection chooses the winning hand. The idea that something is designed by chance is contradictory." End quote. Now, the scientific point that Greg is missing here is the fact that natural selection ain't chance. And in fact, it's the exact opposite of chance. Natural selection is a deterministic process by which populations and their environments interact in statistically measurable ways that produce probabilistic outcomes that ain't random. But the bigger picture here goes back to what Greg says about design. Greg is arguing that either God designs the specific details of the natural world directly, or else he ain't designing nothing at all. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, Greg's imagination ain't big enough to allow for a God so smart that he could produce a complete design just by setting the initial parameters and then letting nature take its course. And because Greg can't imagine a God that smart, God can't be that smart. The only way Greg's God can actually design the world around us is to specifically touch and shape and mold every individual detail. And that's the hallmark of an imaginary God. Greg's God can't be smarter than Greg is willing and able to imagine him being. Otherwise, Greg wouldn't be able to know for sure that God could not create evolution. And yet he does know, and he knows it with absolute certainty. Because imaginary characters can only do what you's willing and able to imagine them doing. Oh, but Greg ain't done yet. Not only is he going after theistic evolution, he's going after all of science. Quote, "Many people think knowledge begins and ends with the scientific method, and anything not confirmed by science is mere opinion and unsubstantiated belief. However, those who hold this view will be surprised to know that it commits suicide." End quote. And his argument here is that you can't justify the scientific method by appealing to the scientific method, because they supposedly ain't no scientific evidence that the scientific method works. Which, considering that we ain't sitting around in animal skins hunting and gathering, is obvious horse apples. I think what Greg is going for here is some kind of philosophical epistemological argument, which other apologists has done better. But even there, it's a losing argument because the best you can do is to argue that the scientific method ain't an infallible source of knowledge. And that's the whole point of the scientific method, recognizing that our tools for knowing is fallible, and taking rigorous steps to fact-check our conclusions and revise them from time to time as necessary. The fact that science second-guesses itself and challenges its own conclusions is the reason why it has been far, far more successful than competing approaches to knowledge. And the relative success rate of the scientific method as compared to other methods is scientific evidence in favor of the scientific method. Science don't need to be infallible, it just needs to be better than everything else. And it is, demonstrably so. Next on the chopping block, religious pluralism. Quote, "The notion of religious pluralism, that all religions are equally true or valid, is also self-refuting." End quote. Now, Greg makes an assumption here that at least one of the world's religions must be true, but that ain't a safe assumption, nor is it one he's even attempted to justify. If all religions is equally false, then they all has the same truth value, which is none. Now, it may be the case that folks find value in their religious beliefs anyway, and they want the freedom to exercise their religions, and it's definitely the case that unless everybody has religious freedom, then nobody has religious freedom. If you pick one particular religion and elevate it above all the others, that ain't freedom, that's privilege. And privilege is precisely what Greg is arguing for here. He wants his own religion to be given a special status as a religion that's held to be above reproach and binding on all citizens regardless of their personal beliefs. And this kind of theocracy is something that Christians has continually tried to pull off ever since Constantine. And every time, the result has been a society so corrupt and repressive that later generations has declared them to be not true Christians. But believers like Greg never learn from the universal absence of any kind of divine blessing on this sort of enterprise, and they keeps making the same mistake over and over and over again. Greg's last example is kind of weird. Quote, I once saw a sign in a restaurant that read, "You are what you eat." I pointed out to the waitress that if we are what we eat, then we couldn't be something until we eat something. But we can't eat something unless we are something. Therefore, it's not true that we are what we eat. End quote. To which the poor waitress replied, "Oh, you have to talk to the manager," leading Greg to believe that he'd scored a glorious victory. Really, I feel sorry for any waitress that has to wait on Greg. They just don't deserve to be treated the way he habitually treats them. Anyways, I gotta admit, this one kinda stumped me at first. Really, Greg? You's going after you are what you eat? My first thought was that he was just being silly here, trying to end the chapter on a humorous note. But as I thought about it, I realized that no, Greg was being legitimately triggered here, and he was taking out his irritation on the poor waitress because he had to lash out at something. See, Greg don't believe that we are what we eat. Greg believes that we are invisible, immaterial, immortal souls that's only temporarily clothed in material bodies. The reminder that we's material beings is a sour note in the Hallelujah chorus he's got singing inside of his head, and he don't like it. The problem is that, as nice as immortality might sound to some folks, objective reality keeps testifying to the fact that life and consciousness and everything about us is material. You take every single attribute of this supposed soul, and it turns out to be a material process in the material brain. And we know that because if we use anesthesia to shut down the material processes in the brain, it all goes away. Thought, perception, emotion, will, memory, everything. Once you take away everything that's a material process, ain't nothing left to be the soul. Same for life itself. We consume material, non-living nutrients, or at least I hope they's non-living, and I guarantee you if they weren't when you started, they will be by the time they gets to your stomach and digest for a while. But the thing is, our bodies take them non-living nutrients and turns them into living cells. And the reason our bodies can do that, and in fact absolutely have to do that, is because life is a material process that sustains itself with material nutrients. Souls ain't got nothing to do with it. And Greg hates to be reminded of that because he don't want to believe it. So he consoles himself by thinking up a silly argument for why we can't be what we eat. But his argument's a non sequitur. He says that if we are what we eat, then we can't be something until we eat something. But that don't follow. The statement, "we are what we eat," is a general description of a current reality. And it's true. Every cell in our body is made up of nutrients that we've consumed at some point in the past. And if we stop eating, at some point we're going to stop existing, at least as living beings. So there ain't nothing false or self-contradictory about saying we are what we eat. Now, maybe at some point in the past, our bodies was gradually built up out of things our mamas ate, and that's fine. The statement, "you are what you eat," ain't talking about the conditions that apply during gestation. If and you's old enough to read the sign, then you's reached a stage where what it says is true. And to deny that it's true like Greg does is simply a denial of reality, which just goes to show how religion can interfere with your ability to accurately understand the world around you. And that's it for Chapter 10. Greg set out to do a survey of ideas that he thinks is self-contradictory, notably omitting any mention of the Trinity, and in fact he did list a few that was genuine self-contradictions, like the idea that there's no such thing as truth. Most of his examples, though, kind of backfired on him, and his last one just made him look silly and petulant. He's pretty good at understanding the theory of self-contradicting arguments, but his practice leaves a lot to be desired. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to wrap it up for me for today. Next time, we're going to take up Chapter 11, entitled Practical Suicide. Apparently, he's doubling down on the bad taste he uses to pick his chapter titles. But there's some good material in there regardless, so stay tuned. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.